I just want to thank Daniel Cullen is associated with the Jack Miller Center, which gave us some funding to help support this program and our year-long series on free speech and intellectual diversity in higher education in American society. So thank you again, everybody, for staying, and I'll turn it over to Daniel. Professor Cullen, I should say.
Thanks, Carol. So I noticed that ours is the only panel in the conference explicitly tasked to take up philosophy. So you might fasten your seatbelts and prepare for a rapid ascent from the familiar. The qualifiers in our topic are interesting too. Apparently, inquiry need not be free. Perhaps this has to do with its typically narrow purpose to bring something specific to light, like Russian meddling or collusion. And an inquisition suggests an obsessive pursuit of a particular quarry, famously like heresy. So what makes inquiry free? Perhaps liberation from a specific purpose, even from a serious one. A free inquiry has a superficial oddness about it, suggesting an aimless search or an unencumbered desire to know. Education means a leading out, or maybe better, a being called out, especially out of ourselves, out of our condition of everydayness, by something that induces thought or wonder. But what makes it higher? Aristotle said some things are to be known not for some useful purpose, but for their own sake. The higher things, the things intrinsically worth knowing, are strictly speaking useless. So inquiring minds want to know, and to know freely and without an immediate purpose. And it looks like we've just stumbled onto the definition of liberal education itself. I don't know specifically what our panelists are going to say, but I bet that inevitably it will link up with the question of a liberal education. It's time to meet them, but there's not enough time to give them their due. Harvey Mansfield, the William Kennan Jr. professor at government at Harvard University, is America's greatest living political scientist, in part because he keeps alive the tradition of political philosophy, but also because he practices the latter, albeit with an indirection characteristic of some of the thinkers your program indicates that he has studied. He's done more than study. In fact, it's fair to say he's revolutionized our understanding of many of them. Your program also says, with great caution, some people with some reason call him a conservative. At Harvard, he is the balance. But how he understands himself, how he defines himself, is more elusive. But I know on at least one occasion, he said he was best described as a philosophic radical, a category that transcends partisan identifications. James Stoner is the Herman Moyes Jr. Professor of Political Science at LSU, where he directs the Eric Voegelin Institute. Like his teacher, Harvey Mansfield, he is an uncommon political scientist. He can probably do regression analysis with the best of them, as Steve Hayward was referring to last night, but he's a leading scholar of constitutional law, of constitutionalism, and of the latter's philosophic sources. And you can figure out what the ascending order is for him. He's recently turned his attention to the issue of free speech, starting with the often forgotten question, what is free speech for? Norma Thompson teaches political philosophy in the humanities at Yale University, where she directs the undergraduate studies for the humanities and is co-director of the Whitney's Humanities Center. I know her especially as a tireless advocate for liberal learning, not only at Yale, but at everywhere, through her books, her essays, her speeches, and her academic leadership. She's a scholar of ancient political thought, but that's only one of many windows she opens on our intellectual tradition, as you'll see. Please welcome them, and we'll hear first from Harvey Mansfield.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your introduction, which sets a record for overgenerosity. I'm going to talk about the value of free speech and not so much the right of free speech, because I think the right of free speech takes the value of it for granted. And concentrating on the right of free speech leads to discussion of extremes, of parameters, when you can exercise your speech, how extensive it can be, and what limitations there must be. But the right of free speech presupposes the value of free speech, which presupposes the value of speech. Speech means giving reasons that you use to appeal to your fellow human beings who also have the power of reason. Speech presupposes that man is a rational animal. He may wrap his reasons in illustrations, in metaphors, in fables, in poetry of some kind, but speech consists in argument. Well, not every speech. How many arguments end up with one of the two partners, usually the male, saying, "Shut up"? But still, that points to an argument because it tells you that this person has a notion that it's not always wise to speak. And that's a not so false and also an interesting point. Today, absorption in the right of free speech leads to confusion of speech and expression. And saying that free speech is the same thing as free expression. This comes, I think, from the Supreme Court case in the middle of World War II, 1943, of West Virginia versus Barnett, the famous flag salute case. Flag salutes were said in this case to be symbolic speeches, and therefore compelling. A flag salute is a compelling speech. If you force somebody to salute the flag, you're compelling him to speak, because a salute is a gesture, and a gesture is a form of utterance. And from this comes expression. So with this case and many others following it, speech is expanded to expression. And in the process, speech loses its rationality. So the Jehovah's Witnesses in this case, the Barnett case, thought that the flag, the American flag, was a graven image. But they needed an explanation of their gesture in refusing to salute the flag from speech. Or Colin Kaepernick of the San Francisco 49ers, kneeling during the national anthem. Just by itself, that gesture could be repentance or submission, as well as defiance. But it becomes expression only when the expression takes the form of speech, and you say, what is your point in doing this? So the result of this confusion is that free speech becomes a part of free expression. And I think that in law school, if you took a course on the First Amendment, or this part of the First Amendment, it would be a course on free expression rather than on free speech. But of course, the Constitution and in the First Amendment speaks of speech and not expression. So first, free expression becomes speech by saying that expression is a gesture, which equals a form of utterance. And then afterwards, free speech falls to the status of a part of free expression. Expression is a dilution, not the essence of speech. There are ways of interpreting expression. You can speak of free speech as airing a grievance, but that means that the purpose of free speech is purging yourself, make you feel better, cathartic. Or you can say that free speech has the function of offering perspectives, different perspectives. There isn't any truth, there is only perspectives. The argument that speech is purging comes from Machiavelli. The argument that speech is perspectives comes from Nietzsche. These are philosophers of violence, not friends of human reason and free societies. Justice Jackson in the Barnett case said, "A person gets from the symbol the meaning that he puts into it." No, the meaning is an argument. The symbol symbolizes an argument, and an argument is made to others. Otherwise, you get an abuse of self-expression when self-expression is actually used to protest against speech. Expression in our time has become one of the two enemies of free speech. Free speech presupposes the primacy of argument. An argument is more than one side. Free speech means the freedom to disagree, but disagree on the basis of a counter-argument. Man is a rational animal who uses reason to choose on the basis of argument. So free speech presupposes the efficacy of reason or of choice between or among arguments. Political speech, to be sure, is always or frequently or usually assertive. You're saying something together with a demand to be heard, but it's still an argument. So free speech is a sign that man is essentially free and not a slave. The two enemies of free speech today both make human beings into a slave. Both of them attack or rob us, as one sometimes hears, rob us of free agency. First is speech as dictated by the urge to express yourself. That's the first enemy. And the second is speech as dictated by self-interest. First, self-expression, which I began with. Of course, speech comes from the self, but it rises above the self when it gives a reason. And so even Socrates in Plato's dialogue, The Apology, defends himself, to be sure, but he also says he defends, quote, someone like himself. Not just Socrates, not just me, but the philosopher. So say an African American defending himself against the slight that he meets with, still, unfortunately, in our society. Speaks of a minority, that is, a people in his position, not just himself. Reason generalizes and universalizes. Therefore, reason is a vehicle, an instrument of freedom. You can lift yourself out of your circumstances and no longer let them determine you. And with this, you can appeal to others in different circumstances. Doesn't my complaint make sense? Self-expression becomes an enemy to reason when the power of reason is denied. When it's said that all generalization is fraud. It's just yourself, your urge, your id, which is directing you. So reason is really your slavery, not your freedom. As I said before, this is the philosophy of Nietzsche. Very powerful today. Surprisingly, though, people don't, I think, recognize the full extent of his influence. Reason, according to this, is rationalization. It serves yourself. It doesn't justify, it serves yourself. And therefore, self-expression is more important than speech. You must use your self-expression to give your opponent a middle finger. The second enemy of free speech is self-interest. Self-interest says that your speech follows from your interest, reflects it, cannot change it. You can change your mind, but you cannot change your interest. Your mind is the prisoner of your interest. And there are two forms of this. One very old and unsophisticated, another new to our time and sophisticated. The old one is character assassination, always a feature of political speech. You have a bad character. This is your interest, which determines what you say, and therefore we can ignore your arguments and focus on your failings. Your reason does not have power to rise above your lousy character. Your reason is a captive to you. Hence, speech becomes insult and insinuation. This is always a danger in democracies, in which a demos exists that enjoys bringing down the high and the mighty and the presumptuous, the elite. Don't listen to them. And then there's another form of self-interest, the new or more sophisticated work of an elite that's found in social or political science. And here I depart a little bit from Robert Post this morning, but made this lovely distinction between academic freedom and the freedom of formal free speech, which I very much enjoyed and agree with. But academic freedom doesn't always produce truth. Since another thing I heard this morning was a reference to Bolshevism. How did we learn the truth about Bolshevism? From the universities? No. We learned it from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who didn't have any free speech and wrote in a prison camp that he described. Speech, according to social or political science, speech cannot cause. It can only be caused. People say and act according to their interests, which are open or concealed. So, for example, the kind of science that makes survey data. Survey data comes out a survey of opinions. Opinion is something subjective, but survey data, through some magic, is objective. It's a science. It's the study of causes with a view to making predictions, how you will be caused by the discoveries that the computations that we make. This assumes that human beings cannot choose or guide themselves. Human beings are essentially slaves to the causes that political scientists impute to them. You vote by your interest. That's a kind of insult. Speech cannot be a cause, and therefore speech has no value. Well, this is just my beginning. I have much further to go, but this is what I have time for today. Later on, one would have to show why freedom is essentially political freedom, or political liberty, as Madison said in Federalist Number 10, or Tocqueville in his Democracy in America. And choice. What is choice? What is there to choose? What question would an intelligent person, consider to be the central question of political liberty? So I leave with that reminder that this is altogether incomplete, but I do want to say something about, or stress the value of speech in free speech.
Thank you for that, Harvey. Jim Stoner.
I've taken for the topic of my remarks today, in praise of euphemism. I immediately alert you to be suspicious of that topic, although of course the alert among you are already scowling. To speak in condemnation of euphemism might seem an appropriate topic for a panel on free speech. To speak freely is to speak the truth without prettifying your subject, but rather presenting it just as it is. Euphemisms, expressions that exaggerate the excellence or the goodness of the person, deed, or thing described while covering up the faults. Euphemisms seem to be a form of lying to the audience, sometimes even by the speaker to himself. Calling slaves servants, or injustices necessities, or the crippled special, or the ugly different would in each case be to euphemize. Why, free speech itself in recent years has been called a euphemism for hate speech when the mantle of free speech is invoked to excuse deliberately giving offense with words. Now, if these examples don't get you wondering whether the condemnation of euphemism is right, that is, whether euphemism might not deserve a little praise, consider the relation of euphemism to democracy. On the one hand, euphemism might be thought characteristic of monarchical government, where, because the king can do no wrong, he must be spoken well of, and where, as a consequence, the whole hierarchical structure of authority is spoken of with a certain respect, whether or not it's really deserved. Republican citizens, by contrast, particularly when they rose up to challenge monarchy with their free speech, disdained euphemism. Wrote Thomas Jefferson in a revolutionary pamphlet addressed to George III, and I quote, "Let those flatter who fear. It is not an American art. To give praise which is not due might be well from the venal, but would ill beseem those who are asserting the rights of human nature. They know and will therefore say that kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. Open your breast, sire, to liberal and expanded thought," end quotation. I'll come back to Jefferson in a moment, but today we would have to add that democracy has its euphemisms too, particularly in referring to the people as a whole, but also in referring to the weak or disadvantaged, or to euphemize the non-elite. Instead of lame, we say disabled, and now we say differently abled. Speaking historically, we're asked not to speak of slaves, but of enslaved persons. I was asked just this week by a copy editor, this is a true story, to change the word statesman in a manuscript to politician so that women don't feel excluded, thus reversing the valence, since statesman used to be a euphemism for politician. Now it's reversed. Science tries to euphemize by inventing new terms. So, for example, it renamed the stupid retarded, but now that's become an insult, so we say learning disabled. Much that today we decry as political correctness is a request or maybe a demand for euphemism. Now, I want to address three questions about euphemisms. First, are they lies? Second, if so, are they nevertheless needful or useful? And third, if so, are they equally needed or useful everywhere, or can we, for example, differentiate between the university and the public square? So first, are euphemisms lies? Jefferson apparently thought so. Lies and flattery. Telling the truth, we hear, requires critical thinking, and critique disdains euphemism. In a fine little book made from lectures he gave towards the end of his life, titled Fearless Speech, Michel Foucault argues that to the Greeks, free speech, or parousia, meant telling the truth bluntly and plainly, without rhetorical adornment. It was a privilege kings sometimes granted to their advisors, and democracies granted to citizens in their assemblies. They knew to dispense with euphemism when a serious decision had to be made. Cut the nonsense. Well, that's probably a euphemism. Cut the nonsense and get the facts. But Jefferson himself employs a euphemism. Kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people, he wrote. Where was that true in his day? Well, of course, Jefferson meant that as a statement of right, not of fact. And unless we would be cynics, which, by the way, was the subject of Foucault's next and last book, or else nihilists, shouldn't we imagine people to be a little better than they often are, precisely if we want to encourage them to be better still? Modern thought is critical and takes pride in its realism, but classical thought, for example, Aristotle, held that nothing was known unless one knew its purpose, its end or perfection, its final cause, the good for which it was striving. One can say this generally of men, wrote Machiavelli, at least if we can trust his translator, that they are ungrateful, fickle, pretenders and dissemblers, evaders of danger and eager for gain. Wrote Aristotle, by contrast, in the first sentence of his Metaphysics, all men by nature desire to know. Is that, Aristotle's statement, just a euphemism, or does it capture a truth that Machiavelli neglects? Jefferson and his fellows summoned an inchoate assembly of outcast provincials to throw off the yoke of the greatest world power and to construct a polity that would replace it and offer to millions of people the opportunity to pursue barely imagined modes of human development. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, two politicians, praised their respective countrymen and proved them better than they themselves thought they were, overcoming thereby a totalitarian despotism established by a critical theory that failed to critique itself. So I don't concede that euphemisms are lies, or at least that they're wholly lies, but even if they were, would they still be necessary or useful? Plato's Socrates thought so. In the Republic, he notoriously argues that even or precisely the best city had to be founded on a lie, that citizens are brothers, but that the differences between them are natural and unalterable, requiring that they be sorted into hierarchical classes. at once to hide and to embody the truth that they have differential capacities for truly human fulfillment, and thus deserve different benefits from the city. We Americans, of course, reject that notion and proclaim, in the words of Jefferson again, that all are equal, saying, in fact, that we hold this as a truth. Now, Socrates, in telling his companions, but not his citizens, that the city had to be founded on a lie, told them what he saw as a truth. Actually, he called it a noble lie or beautiful lie, suggesting perhaps that a city, to be just, ought to strive to be noble, to overcome itself, so to speak. He distinguishes the noble lie from what he calls the true lie, by which he means a lie that a person tells himself, a failure to face the truth, perhaps especially the truth about himself. In public, for the city, Socrates prescribes the noble lie. In private, the test of the philosophic soul is one's capacity to face with equanimity the truth about oneself. Do we Americans, proudly proclaiming the truth of human equality, speak in a public voice or in a philosophic one? Do even those who most adamantly insist upon equality today hold it as a truth? Now, if there is something to the Platonic insight that one ought to speak differently in public and in private, to the polity on the one hand, to philosophic friends on the other, then perhaps free speech ought to be understood differently in the public sphere than in the university, according to their different ends, supposing these to be justice and the common good for the polity, and for the university, the discovery and transmission of truth. In the polity, euphemism is a practical necessity, each party putting the best face it can on its own adherents and on its goals and ideals, though naturally enough treating its opponents to the opposite of euphemism, which I'll call animadversion, James Madison's term in his great critique of the Sedition Act. Deliberation requires both, promoting a goal or ideal and thinking clear-headedly about problems and dangers. And so in a free republic or democracy, where parties naturally arise, both contribute to deliberation and thus ought to tolerate one another's euphemisms and animadversions. That's political counsel, not only a goal or ideal. Recognize the power of noble rhetoric to gather friends, political friends, but be aware of the risk that speaking ill of one's opponents is apt to alienate them, some of whom one might one day need as political friends. It also means that any attempt to control public speech is apt to be partisan, whether by forbidding the expression of certain sentiments or by mandating the expression of others. I mean control of the expression of political opinions. Incitement to violence as to crime can be rightly suppressed, I think, and ought to be if the courts would restore the once bright line also expressed by Jefferson between speech and action. In the university, euphemism is mostly out of place. Professors ought to have the courage to say the truth as they see it, and also, perhaps more urgently right now, the justice to listen to what those who do not share their views have to say. One of these truths is that all opinions are not equal, and therefore one is not obliged to give equal time to wisdom and folly, if the folly is evident, unless to let folly show its true colors to the previously deceived. Of course, universities are microcosms of society to some degree, not merely circles of friends, so perhaps some of the euphemisms needed in the world must be admitted, at least so as not to discourage students before they begin to learn. But precisely because learning proceeds dialectically, universities need to be on their guard against partisanship, or at least partisanship on behalf of anything except the truth. In his book, The Art of Rhetoric, Aristotle distinguishes three kinds of rhetorical speech: the forensic, the deliberative, and the celebratory. I've said a bit about the deliberative. The forensic has its place in law courts, where euphemism is most out of place, and maybe also in research, as I hinted when I spoke of the critical attitude of the modern mind. Aristotle's third category, the celebratory, is probably the most neglected today, and therefore the most needed. Surely it's the most akin to euphemism, for it involves speaking well of the good, something he thinks human beings need to hear from time to time and actually find pleasurable, again, when not corrupted by cynicism or nihilism. Although their chief activity is not rhetorical but dialectical, dialectic being the counterpart to rhetoric, even universities used to know how to use celebratory rhetoric. Actually, they still use it, but now in describing their customers rather than their purpose. Or have they forgotten that purpose or confused it with the purpose of the polity and its parties? If so, perhaps free inquiry cannot be restored without attention to the good. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jim. Norma
Thank you.
Thompson.
I'm going to approach free speech and liberal education through a case study. The Woodward Report of 1974 was a high point in Yale's classical free speech tradition. It was produced after the controversial speaker, William Shockley, was shouted down by Yale undergraduates for his statements on genetics and sterilization among certain populations. The report urged the university to commit to the momentous idea, quote, that the results of free expression are to the general benefit in the long run, however unpleasant they may appear at the time. There was one dissenting voice in that 1974 report, a Yale graduate student in economics and law, but trained at Harvard, whose stipulated authorities were Marshall McLuhan and Herbert Marcuse, among others. He derided the majority for being facile and simplistic, and for heaping value judgments onto its historical review, declaring that, quote, power relationships enter into our language and must be accounted for. Insisting that liberation of the oppressed must come before the cause of free speech, he put the free marketplace of ideas in scare quotes and criticized the majority's belief that, quote, good ideas will drive out bad ideas. Such denunciations were common in the late 70s when I was in college and in my Marxist phase. I too was complaining about how all knowledge is relative and the result of social conditioning. For a while, Marcuse answered everything for me. But a shock to my Marxism came from a history of political thought course. Burke, who I was told was the enemy, seemed to make a lot of sense. I read Tocqueville and then the ancients, and my fellow traveling days were over. That was my own personal marketplace of ideas. And yes, the good ones beat out the bad. But as usual, I went one way and the world went another. The views of that dissenting Yale graduate student in 1974 have won the day, and the minority voice has become the majority. There is nothing in his list of charges that departs significantly from the way infamous Yale controversies of 2015 were portrayed, when a certain Halloween email caused faculty members Erica and Nicholas Christakis to be hounded out of Silliman College. As one undergraduate screamed, the right of some people to express themselves does not trump the right of people of color to live free of harassment. Directly following that explosive time, it was difficult to get a handle on what was going on among the disaffected. More recently, the grievances have come into focus. The Atlantic magazine, for one, has been helpful for sorting things out. In a 2016 interview, an undergraduate explicates her view of racism at Yale, charging that white students don't understand the depth of the problem because they avoid taking courses in AFAM where racism is studied. I could sympathize with this because these Yale students aren't taking my courses in humanities either. So I took the students' advice and jotted down those I should read to educate myself. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Eugene Robinson, Michelle Alexander, Elijah Anderson, among others. It seemed providential when, shortly thereafter, I walked into a bookstore to find the highly recommended Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Why providential? Well, in the foreword to her book, Cornel West puts her New Jim Crow in the lineage of The Strange Career of Jim Crow by C. Van Woodward, the very same author of Yale's 1974 Woodward Report. So I decided to read the two books in tandem. The subject is an ugly swath of American history. Woodward's book is grim reading, but it is nevertheless a superb analysis. He names the villains, he traces a complex story, he indicates how things could have gone otherwise, and he's modest in his aims and claims. Woodward's preface sets the tone, quote, "I shall expect and hope to be corrected." It's not surprising that an internationally admired historian would be chosen to lead an inquiry into free speech. Indeed, part of the Woodward Report is a history of free speech. Its tone is calm, measured, open to suggestion. We used to say, objective. The Michelle Alexander book presents the strongest possible contrast. I thought back to Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. There are familiar Marxist stipulations, the world historical scope of the issue, the need for total revolution, the irrelevance of facts contrary to her narrative, and the anticipations of false consciousness wherever characters in the narrative do not act as predicted. It is not just Marxist, though. It's full of questionable rhetorical practices such as using passive constructions to insinuate vast racial conspiracies. No doubt the topic of Alexander's work is deadly serious. She argues that mass incarceration in the U.S. has affected blacks all out of proportion to convictions for minor drug offenses. The conspiracy part is that whites opposed to racial reform have orchestrated this, concealing their bias through race-neutral language, hence the Jim Crow analogy. My concern is that it's not just the white students who aren't taking AFAM courses. It's also the black students who are only taking AFAM classes, taking in the new Jim Crow, and avoiding the dead white males, Herodotus, Plato, and Aristotle, the ones who interest me by challenging conventional pieties and by identifying sound versus unsound rhetorical practices. The real intellectual diversity of the Western tradition is being dismissed out of hand, while contemporary writers like Michelle Alexander repeat Marxist doctrines and therefore are indebted to a dead white male without seeming to be aware of it. She's getting away with underhanded rhetorical practices such as the opening statement, quote, "Jarvis Cotton cannot vote like his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. He has been denied the right to participate in our electoral democracy." Cotton's family tree tells the story of several generations of black men who were born in the United States, but who were denied the most basic freedom that democracy promises, the freedom to vote for those who will make the rules and laws that govern one's life, end quote. She uses this example to prove how little things have actually changed. But there is at least one Yale professor who was bold enough to take issue with how she has framed this picture. James Forman Jr., professor of law at Yale Law School, notes, quote, that there is one salient difference between Cotton and his ancestors. They couldn't vote because they were black. Cotton lost his right to vote when he was convicted of murder. Details, details. Later, Forman interjects sternly when Alexander writes, quote, "Today, mass incarceration defines the meaning of blackness in America. Black people, especially black men, are criminals. That is what it means to be black," end quote. He responds, "Today, nothing defines the meaning of blackness in America," end quote. James Forman Jr. has my deepest respect. How could he get away with this? Perhaps it helps that he's black, the son of a civil rights hero, and the author of his own outstanding book on mass incarceration. But Professor Forman transcends these explanatory characterizations when he courageously declares that the Jim Crow analogy is objectionable because, quote, "it neglects some important truths and must be criticized in the service of truth," end quote. I probably don't need to tell you that James Forman Jr. is using the word truth here without scare quotes, as if it were an unproblematic aspiration for a legal scholar to write in the service of truth. That kind of now retrograde thinking goes straight back to the majority Woodward conclusions of 1974. And it's very hard to find at Yale today. So you see, my circle is complete. My narrative is satisfying in a literary kind of way. But if you ask what all of this has to do with free speech, I would have to acknowledge some misgivings. In the course of tracing this odd Yale story, the free speech question has revealed itself to have very little to do with shouting down unpopular speakers. It looks more like tearing down the tradition of liberal education. When I wrote my book on Herodotus, I made use of a concept called fighting stories to describe the stories and diverse amplifications about an event of time past that begin immediately to battle their way into the discourse of intellectual history and persist there over time. That worked for the first historian of the West, and it seemed to me to apply to canon questions as well. It's the very definition of a classic that it withstands the demands of time. Implausible works get into the canon by fighting their way in. An example is Moby Dick, which languished, mostly unread, for 60-plus years after its publication, before readers raised it to the rank of greatness. Works get into the canon by fighting their way in, by providing insights into enduring human concerns, by speaking truthfully to human nature, and more powerfully of the human condition than do their early critics. Classics aren't born overnight. There really is something to the test of time. Cornel West has declared Michelle Alexander's work to be, quote, an instant classic. I don't know how that represents anything but a complete abdication of all standards of evidence. Some pre-approved writers get a free pass on political grounds. If so, they probably won't stand the test of time. I've seen this show before a few times. Remember Callicles and the Gorgias? Sloppy with sources, extravagant in claims, dismissive of Socrates' injunction to follow the Logos wherever it goes. Callicles basically tells Socrates to drop dead. Socrates says of Callicles that he's incurable. End of story. The refusal to speak in civil terms is a refusal to think, which can and has presaged the ends of civilizations. But I'll try to end in a constructive way. I'd like to join forces with the AFAM students who want to study works that highlight the continuing injustices experienced by the African American population. I want to teach ancient political thought and rhetoric also for the purpose of penetrating more deeply the ills of contemporary democratic society. Let's study together in good faith. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Eugene Robinson, Michelle Alexander, and Elijah Anderson in the context of a long tradition of political thought. Call me hopelessly optimistic, but I'm asking the dissenters not to outlaw dissent. Thank you.
I'll ask the audience to pose some questions in a moment, and I think the best thing to do is to try and pose a question for the entire panel, but if not, I'll invite the entire panel to comment. These were very diverse presentations, but there were some overlapping themes, and let me try to pose one question for all of you, and you could take this opportunity to respond to each other or to sharpen one of your own points if you like. At the end of your presentation, Norma, I had in mind the student now famous who berated Nicholas Christakis, among other things, insisting that he didn't understand that this was her home. And I think by extension, to pick up on something Harvey said earlier, she wasn't making that claim only for herself, but on behalf of all students, that this was not simply an educational institution. This was a home where they had certain rights that transcended things like academic freedom. Your final point made me think of this. You're asking students who you said have a resistance to thinking, or I think you used the term of refusal to think. Isn't this, so to speak, the problem of trying to figure out how to awaken the student who is, as we say now, already woke? Someone for whom resistance to what you mean by thinking, openness to new arguments, is that resistance is understood as an expression of or as a commitment to justice. In other words, I'm wondering how one gets beyond that barrier between politics and education, or politics and philosophy. And so much of what both Harvey and Jim had to say about free speech and argument emphasized its natural place in politics, and I think by extension made the point that it's out of place in an educational setting. But that's exactly the problem that we face today, isn't it? Trying to disaggregate those, or at least to try to understand what the limits are of political arguments in a larger educational arena. And I'm just wondering specifically, how do you think we progress beyond where we are now? What would it take? What practical things could we do?
Well, found a school like this at Arizona State University, and to make it available, make both reason and politics available. That's, I think, reference to that is to statesmanship, and the higher reaches of reason in the great books, which are also a feature of this school. So that combination, I think, is a very healthy one, and more power to you.
Create an outpost.
In which civility should be named as part of the description. I think that's rather fundamental. The example that you cited of the young woman who obviously lost control and in an outburst of anger, screaming at the master of the college, challenging him because he had the audacity to think that his position was one in which he was supposed to be exerting intellectual authority. And she was claiming, no, this is a home. And then the obscenities came out. I mean, there was no good outcome there, except to say that I think people were so horrified afterwards that people talked, and therefore some civility was restored. But in the moment, that was an incurable moment as far as I was concerned. That there was no political resolution. It was an ugly moment, and it's only the shock value of it that I think incited discussions that were a little more helpful after the fact.
Wasn't the same student later given an award for campus leadership?
Yes, no comment.
Or candor in speech.
Yeah.
Failure to use euphemism.
Right. Jim, you said a lot about euphemism. You didn't say anything about its opposite.
Animadversion, I think.
Dysphemism. And I wonder in particular how you would categorize hate speech. Is it, I think you said it was an example of euphemism, but isn't it more like the opposite, the branding of something as worse than it is? And that's the typical issue on campus today. That's an idea that is unwelcome or partisan, provocative, can be branded hate speech and excluded for that reason.
Well, I actually wouldn't have a problem. I say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I wouldn't have a problem establishing a rule that would fine people for the use of certain words, certain obscenities. For one thing, it would help expand the vocabularies of faculty as well as students, I think. But that's not banning the ideas, right? You can make the distinction between particular words. I don't mind the bright line rules, even if now and again there's a problem. I don't think Robert Jackson is where the court went wrong, but I definitely think Cohen v. California, when Justice Harlan, the second Justice Harlan, uses the same word that the young lady used at Yale. In the reports, the U.S. reports, and then approves it being on a jacket that was carried into a courtroom. I think that was a problem. But, I mean, that's just to say that, speech is complex in that way. Yes, there are words that have emotive power, but are many places where they don't belong, and that's... Now, I'm not saying that doesn't always have to be enforced by law, any of these restrictions by law, right? Sometimes with speech, it's better by norm than by law. I also think, by the way, that she was right on the point about home. I don't know in the particular use. I mean, obviously, it was not an appropriate use to cuss out the master of the house. By the way, I don't think Yale should have gotten rid of the name master of the house. It was put in place when rich young boys, right, would come to Yale, and now they had to understand they were under a master because they don't know. And that's something they ought to think about. Have they gotten rid of the master's degree yet, or not? Not yet, or it's on the way. But I guess with regard to hate speech, I think there are certain epithets like that. It's perfectly appropriate to punish in some way, although I prefer a sort of symbolic punishment in a kind of way to that at first. And but not the ideas. You have to distinguish between, I think, the words that are meant to incite and the ideas behind them. Again, Holmes said every idea is an incitement. Well, that's a nice quip, and there's something to it, but I think it helps when the law draws bright lines. And by the way, I have a candidate for the canon, which is W.E. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which, in fact, Woodward was, I think, instrumental in restoring its notice to, and which, despite its Marxist framework, he actually doesn't analyze what happens in Reconstruction too much according to the Marxist terms, but is excellent on the politics that was going on. It's actually a very Republican, smaller Republican book.
Civility has its basis in rationality. Civility calls upon us to suppress our pride, the ease with which we take offense, and reach out to somebody else's reason. So, and it's a good thing because it admits that there is such a thing as taking offense. We're not rational beings, we're rational animals, according to the philosopher. Animals bristle, and so it's quite natural that people take offense. But we also have the possibility of rising above our taking offense, our pride, to take pride in something higher, which is in our unique human capacity for thinking and for reasoning. That's something to be proud of. That's also something to defend against people like Nietzsche and some of our natural scientists.
Right. I think we've provoked a few questions.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. It provokes more questions than I can begin to think of, but I just want to ask one simple question of Professor Mansfield. I was very moved by your distinction between speech, which I take it is associated with the giving of reasons, and hence with the capacity for freedom and generalization, versus expression, which is a form of communication that is not free, just either involuntarily or somehow given without the capacity of giving reasons. And you started out by saying, I'm talking about the value, but not the right. So I want to ask you to shift perspectives from the legal point of view and ask what that does to the distinction you're making. So suppose we're back in the good old 60s, which I remember quite well, and there's a demonstration against Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War, and the crowd is chanting, "No war, no war." They're not giving reasons. So from a technical point of view, they're just expression. The police break up the demonstration and they sue for the First Amendment for freedom of speech. So it seems to me your position, what position would you take on this example? You could say, well, then it was expression, and freedom of speech is only for philosophers who give reasons or for persons who exercise their freedom and give reasons. It's only for, as Rawls would say, the experts in reason giving. Or you could say, actually, in that situation, if you ask them, they might have been able to give reasons. We can constructively attribute reasons to them, in which case the question is, well, when do you make that move? In what situations? When you see before you an example of what is technically and experientially just a case of expression, would you be willing also to say, potentially and actually, it is speech for purposes of the law and the right?
I would. On the one hand, you can't make a law because situations are individual, and on the other hand, you have to.
Yes.
Because you need a rule by which to judge those situations and by which to get people to accept your judgment. So
Yeah.
So I end with this with a problem rather than a real answer. But practically, I think that the practice of the right of free speech is the most important feature in considering it, and I remember there's an argument in Tocqueville, which shows you the slippery slope you start upon when you try to suppress someone's speech, And he just ends up, despite the fact that speech has all these bad connotations and easily slides into offensive and disruptive expression or protest, it's better, as far as you can, to let them speak, quote, speak, unquote.
Right. So all I would say is that when you consider this from the point of view of the law, even though the distinction you put on the table is valuable, it looks quite different, and you need criteria which may be different than the one you introduced in the first place.
Yes, it's just that I think the legal distinction isn't sufficient.
Yeah.
Because what you have to accept as speech for the law is only an approximation thereof.
Right. Fair enough.
Thank you. Did you want to?
Hi, I'm Laura Beth Nielsen, Northwestern University. I want to talk about Michelle Alexander for a moment, just to correct one thing, I think, of my read, or get your feedback on it, but also as a way of talking about one of the broader issues, which is the role of social science and social knowledge in this philosophical debate. So Michelle Alexander quite explicitly says it's not a conspiracy theory. She talks about it as sort of this birdcage, invisible birdcage kind of thing. And the empirical reality is that the effect is the same, however you got there, of not being able to be a participant in the democratic process as a voter. And so I think I teach that book, and one of the reasons I do is because it's a great example of trying to disentangle what the political argument is, the normative argument, from what the social science is, right? Because it's this beautiful summary of social science knowledge over and research across a lot of disciplines into an argument. And by helping, I think one of the things that gets lost in this conversation about speech we allow or don't allow, when you're encouraging ideas, I think it's really important to talk about what is the basis for this idea? Is this normative? Is this something that's coming from your religion or your social position or your experience of the world? And what are the things that we know as well as we can until other scientists come along and show us something differently? So show us something different with acceptable, disciplinarily approved peer research published in journals or books. So I just wonder how you think about the role of social science evidence and political theory in this whole debate.
It's not evident to you when you're listening, but I tended to stay very closely to the words in the book so that I wouldn't be accused of misrepresenting her. So I have a lot of her words there, not my rendition of it. Michelle Alexander has done a lot of good in, I would say, 3 or 4 causes that I would be happy to align myself with. But my question is whether she had to use the rhetorical practices that she did, and my answer is no, she didn't, that she would have done better using less subterfuge and less exaggeration. I don't want to minimize the good that has come out of it. I mean, she's had a significant impact in some reforms, so that part is good. I have no problem with it. I would have no problem teaching her work either, but I would want to do it in a context that allows for some discussion of argumentation. There's a course at Yale, or there was a course at Yale in the fall on The Wire, which I would love to take. And her book was one of the only books that was assigned in conjunction with the watching of The Wire, and that's a problem for me because I don't know how it was taught. I wasn't there, so I'm really just suspecting that there was exaggeration in that classroom because of the constricted viewpoint. I would love to teach Michelle Alexander's book in the context of historiography or evidence questions or you name it, but a big context where there are other debaters in the room. That, I think, is just fair. And that, people could come up with their own judgments about the way that she writes. But I don't think in a lot of her classes right now that is up to question, and that's what I'm highlighting.
Allison Stanger, Middlebury College. Thanks so much for a really stimulating panel. I have another question for Professor Thompson. I, too, would take issue with your characterization of Michelle Alexander's work. We can talk a little bit about that more, but I find it to be well worth engaging, thoughtful, well argued, with plentiful evidence for the claims that are being made. But we can agree to disagree about that. What I'd be interested in, since you've read the book, is in hearing what you think of her very surprising argument in the concluding chapter, where a lot of people miss this, but I found it fascinating. She argues against affirmative action, which is, would not follow from an understanding that this is an ideological or polemical work. She argues against it, as you know, because it muddies the issues about the examination of the criminal justice system in the United States. So could you comment on that concluding chapter?
I found it, that was a criticism I had of her, that she was muddying the issues and otherwise would have been very powerful and very effective argumentation. So I wasn't reading it at that point, in terms of what is she going to conclude after all of this. I was reading it at that point as a missed opportunity. A lot of what's in there is really powerful, but it was a lot of it was wasted because of exaggeration and because it alienated a reader's and a certain audience that she would have had if she had not exaggerated or insinuated conspiracy theories and so on. So I left very disappointed with the work, and her conclusion about affirmative action wasn't going to change that because it had already, the damage was already done at that point for me.
We have time for one more.
Jim Weinstein at the College of Law. I'm going to talk a little bit about the use-mention distinction with words and with reference to Cohen versus California, which I think Professor Stoner got a little bit wrong. It wasn't the jacket. Now I'm going to mention, not use the word, said fuck the draft. I wonder what Channel 8 will do with this if they'll bleep it out. But so now it wasn't in a courtroom, it was in a hall of a courtroom. And and one can argue whether the Supreme Court in Cohen, by protecting that use of that particular profanity in public discourse, has coarsened the dialogue or not. But I wanted to play off of that and ask, or to point out that it's one thing to use a word and another to mention it. You also seem, Professor Stoner, to criticize the Supreme Court for putting it in its report verbatim, but they're not using the word. You're not using profanity to somebody or to call it, or you're not just out of anger blurting it out. They're mentioning, and there is that distinction, and this comes up, and I'll leave with this, get your comments. It really goes to euphemism generally that wasn't mentioned on the panel. In terms of racial epithets, there's a lot of pressure now not to even mention them in the classroom, let alone use them. And I've often tried to point out that to use a racial epithet is a very evil thing to do. To mention it may make people feel uncomfortable, but it's not the same thing at all, and I'll leave it with that.
I guess I'm a fan of that euphemism that says the F word and the N word and things of that sort, because I think it conveys that there's something really bad about the word. Now, it might be that obviously what's behind it is what's the attitude that goes into it, right? But we can punish the deed and not necessarily the intention. So I think there's something to be said for whether, I think every time the court uses that word, I think every time a journalist uses that word, or that we use the word on the whole, you did it gently by introducing and so on, and but that it just makes it that easier to repeat and to say again. And so I guess that's it's just a judgment about the word. I think that it's important that there be a sense that there's some things you don't say. And it's not, it doesn't stop an idea, I don't think. Now, and as for Cohen, he wore the jacket outside, he took it off and carried it in. He didn't put it on a rack. So he did carry it into the courtyard, into the courtroom, I think, but that's a minor.
Okay. Again, the mention itself may cause problems,
Yes.
but I don't think you're appreciating the difference between using a word and mentioning a word. And I'd like you, I just suggest that you think.
Well, no, of course there's that difference. But the fact is that that when it then becomes part of the discourse, right, the use of we are also, it's not that when we're teaching, we've put on a lab coat and we're talking about something that we're also not a part of, a discourse and conversation. And by the way, I think that goes back to the issue of social science. I only glanced at Michelle Alexander's book, so I don't know well enough to say much on it. But if I'm not mistaken, is it true that the social science being used has to do with unconscious bias and how that works through the system? Right. So that's a serious question that I don't think you can just say, well, the social science says everybody's got unconscious bias, and then how are people going to react to that? Well, either you proudly say, no, I don't, and resist it, and then an argument has to happen, or you meekly say, gosh, I guess, or maybe rightly say, well, I guess I do, and then you correct yourself. But it's not that, and this is where the use of social science can really become a kind of continuous issue with the question of political speech or social speech, because it either disables us as citizens or sort of sets itself at odds with us as citizens, I think.
That's going to have to be the last word. Thank our panelists